Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, an Iran standoff is heating up.
Iran has warned the United States against any attack, saying Tehran would strike back against Israel and regional U.S. military targets.
With Tehran saying it's ready for war and the U.S. president telling Iranian protesters help is on the way, could this spread far beyond Iran? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. As you're watching the show today, remember to leave us a comment telling us what you think about this episode and what other angles you want to see as news in Iran and beyond continues to unfold. If you're listening to this episode on your podcast app, leave us a review and a rating. It helps other people discover the show.
My name is Negar Mortazavi. I am editor and host of the Iran podcast and a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy.
Negar, welcome to The Take. I've had the privilege of interviewing you about Iran for the past 10 years, at least. And one of the first conversations I can remember us having on Al Jazeera was about sanctions being lifted in 2016 in the wake of the Iran deal and the relief that that was going to bring people. But here we are in 2026, in the third week of mass protests that erupted over the economy and have been met with an internet blackout and a deadly government crackdown. So how would you describe what's happening in Iran right now?
Great to see you, Malika, again. Thanks for having me. I would say the past four and so decades between Iran and the U.S. has mostly been animosity and a path towards conflict and potentially a big war that has just been brewing and brewing. And that era, when we talk about the nuclear negotiations and the lifting of sanctions, was sort of a bump in the road. This is when a U.S. president, Barack Obama, came into office with very serious intention, willing to spend a lot of political capital and also take a lot of heat domestically here, not just from Republicans, but many powerful figures within his own Democratic Party, to say that he wants to resolve this issue and essentially bring fresh thinking to this U.S.-Iran impasse. And he did. He delivered 2 years of very intense negotiations led by John Kerry, former Secretary of State, and a result, which was the JCPOA. To many of us who were watching, that result sounded like a miracle if you had asked us a few years before that. It led to a beginning of sanctions relief for the Iranian people, some breathing of the Iranian economy. This is 2015, 2016, about 10 years ago. And then came President Trump. President Trump came in. He didn't like that deal because it was cut by President Obama. He said he's going to make a better deal. He asked the Iranians to sit down and negotiate another deal with them. The Iranians understandably said, we already cut a deal with a U.S. president. We don't care about the domestic policy of the country and the change of the party. And so President Trump pulled out of that deal, reimposed sanctions and a policy that he called maximum pressure. That was the beginning of this road that we're on. Then he assassinated a top Iranian general, 2020, Qasem Soleimani. President Biden came in. He promised a return to diplomacy. He didn't really prioritize that. Essentially, he continued this maximum pressure policy without really calling it by its name. And then President Trump came back, and within a year, less than a year, we saw the U.S. and Iran go from diplomacy and negotiations all the way to military engagement when the Israelis attacked Iran in June, and then the U.S. joined.
A succinct history there summed up in about 45 seconds, Negar. So how do you take us to today? What are you seeing and hearing happening in Iran?
Well, communication has been almost completely cut off in Iran. And so news and reports are just trickling in out of the country. Some communication has been restored, but it's very hard to paint a full picture of what's going on. But we hear from people that in some areas, in some cities and towns, they really felt like there was a war on the street. So much violence, deadly violence, and bodies piling up, and just raw anger on the side of protesters. This is not the first time Iran is experiencing protests. Every few years now, I would say Iran has seen mass protests, anti-government protests that quickly spread like wildfire across cities and towns. The last one we saw was 2022, the Women Life Freedom protest. Before that, 2019. The spark of that was an economic austerity measure, removal of subsidies, and a hike in fuel prices. And this time also was the spark was an economic issue. The protest started in the bazaar in Tehran, and then they spread across the country. And just in the past few days, we saw a very deadly crackdown of the protests happening. The death toll seems to be pretty high, potentially the highest in the crackdown of mass protests compared to the past ones. The Iranian state is also saying that there's a high death toll on the side of the security forces and police. That seems to also be unprecedented. And this raw anger on the street when you speak to Iranians and protesters is just something that's been unprecedented at a very different level. And people are just targeting the entirety of the system.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because the entirety of the system does very much feel like it's what's at stake here. Because though the protests started over the economy, they ballooned into what looks like a real challenge to the government. But there have also been these pro-government rallies in various parts of the country with tens of thousands of people who've turned out for them. Our correspondent in Tehran, Tawhid Asadi, was covering one of those rallies on Monday for Al Jazeera, and here's what he told us.
Well, what we saw was tens of thousands of people attending a pro-state demonstration here in the capital and across different cities of the country. They are all trying to say that they have received the call from the state on the solidarity and the exigency of staying together. It could be interpreted as a message to the United States and specifically to U.S. President Donald Trump, who has come out to just direct so many threats against the possibility of intervention, and that runs the risk of a potential escalation in the region.
So, Negar, he mentions the rallies could be seen as a message to U.S. President Trump. And I'm wondering how you interpret that message, given Trump has threatened military action against Iran if Iran violently kills peaceful protesters. That's what he said. And just before we sat down for this interview, Trump took to social media, telling Iranians to keep protesting and to take over institutions in the country.
I think the messages coming from the U.S. president they're serious. They're also very contradictory. This week, he was suggesting that there's also a path open for diplomacy. This is something I would say that he's been consistent as far as messaging from the beginning, just in rhetoric, that he said he wants a better deal with Iran. The first time he came, the rhetoric was that the Obama deal was bad, and he's going to make a better deal, the best deal. And what he's been combining that with essentially the opposite, with hard powers, military powers. This time around, he again suggested that he wants negotiations, and that what he wants is that Iran doesn't acquire nuclear weapons. And the Iranians said, okay, that's fine. That's something we have been saying, and we agree. So let's sit down and talk. And they had 5 rounds of negotiations, and then Israel attacked Iran. And to everyone's surprise, the U.S. also joined. So military threats from the U.S., from this president, are now taken very seriously in Iran. And just to add to what you were saying about your correspondent, yes, there's a lot of discontent and opposition to the system, to the status quo, but that doesn't mean that the regime or the state does not have supporters. They do enjoy a solid, strong base. It may not be very high in numbers, but also when you combine the internal unrest with military threats from the outside, you get sort of a gray population in the middle who may sit up. They may say, listen, I'm very opposed to the status quo. Life, the economy, politics, social policy is not working for me, but I also don't want my homeland, my home, civilian infrastructures to be bombed from the outside, which is what happened in June when the Israelis attacked. The framing was that they're targeting the regime, nuclear sites, IRGC, but in reality, About 1,000 Iranians died in Israeli attacks, civilian infrastructure, people's homes. So they would go, for example, for an official or a nuclear scientist, kill his entire family and a dozen neighbors who live in the same building. So people saw the consequence of military threats and attacks from the outside. And we actually in June saw a rally around the homeland, which is a natural reaction when your home is being bombed. You sort of try to band and unite with your neighbors to protect it.
Negar, so much on this story is changing minute by minute. So I am on al-Jazeera.com, which has an Iran live blog with all of the up to the minute news lines. And the one I'm looking at right now has our White House correspondent in Kimberly Hackett saying that Al Jazeera has learned that plans for military action are in the advanced stages, but a decision on whether to strike Iran or take some other form of action has not yet been made. And she's speaking, of course, of the Trump administration's plans. So while we don't know what's going to happen, Iran is responding to this general environment of threats. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, gave an exclusive interview to our colleagues at Al Jazeera Arabic on Monday. And in it, he warned that Iran is ready if Washington wants to, quote, test it.
We are prepared for all options. If they want to test any option, including the diplomatic option, it must be under the conditions I mentioned. What matters is the extent to which a wise approach is adopted.
He said communication channels are open and that Iran is willing to sit down with the U.S. for nuclear negotiations. And President Trump has in the past said that he may meet Iranian officials. He said that as late as Sunday. But then on Tuesday, in that same Truth Social post that I mentioned, right before our interview, he changed course. And he wrote, "I have canceled all meetings with Iranian officials until the senseless killings of protesters stops. Help is on the way." Do you think diplomacy is behind us now?
I'm not sure. I mean, President Trump has been so unpredictable, and I'll give you the two various layers. The U.S. was negotiating with Iran. The Iranians thought they can take it seriously after 5 rounds, when the 6th round was scheduled between Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, and Steve Witkoff, special envoy Witkoff. And then came the Israeli attack. And it wasn't clear if diplomacy all along or towards the end was a ruse and a cover for military preparation, or this just came at the last minute when diplomacy seemed to get serious and the Israelis panicked and essentially went to attack the very negotiating table. I mean, that's my read, that the attack was essentially the main target of that attack was a negotiating table, was diplomacy, because the US and Iran were getting close to achieving something. And now I think this has created a sense of mistrust, an absolute mistrust between the US and Iran, probably to the highest in the past 4 decades, that the Iranians can see two very opposite scenarios. Is he using diplomacy as a ruse to attack us more? Is he trying to bluff with the military threats to supposedly strengthen his hand at the negotiating table and then pursue diplomacy? Is it both at the same time? Because I think President Trump is also, he's so unpredictable and he changes his mind supposedly so quickly that everything can be true in the same week or month. And so I'm not very surprised to see something on Sunday and then the opposite on Tuesday and then maybe in a couple of days. So I would say the Iranians have shown consistently during the first Trump term, of course, during Barack Obama, and then first Trump term, Biden, and second Trump term, that they are interested in diplomacy. They favor that path. They don't want to go to war with the US and Israel for obvious reasons. They are the underdog. They're not going to win the war. They can create headaches, but they're absolutely not going to win the war against the US. But that they prefer diplomacy, but with limits. You know, they have a structure, they have an understanding, they have a red line or red lines for the diplomacy. And what happened at the beginning of the first 6 months of the administration is that diplomacy was moving, but so were the goalposts.
More with Negar after the break. Well, Negar, we are seeing the Western, at least, international reaction harden pretty fast. So, in addition to the U.S. ramping up pressure with hints of stronger action, as we've been talking about, on Monday, President Trump said Iran's trade partners would face 25% tariffs from the U.S. as a way to pressure Tehran. And Europe's rhetoric is also getting sharper, with EU leaders talking about more sanctions and the European Parliament banning Iranian diplomats from entering parliament. What does that change for Iran right now? Anything?
I think these are all important marginally. I mean, the Iranian diplomatic apparatus has responded to the EU, and the tariffs could have some marginal impact. But Iran is also one of the most, if not the most, sanctioned country in the world. U.S. economic sanctions, Western economic sanctions have targeted every industry in Iran, and certain industries have been sanctioned multiple times. And so I don't know if tariffs are going to be a bigger deterrent. They seem like a smaller step, a smaller deterrent if a country is already willing to do, or an entity is willing to do business with Iran, mainly China. China is one of the main partners. Then I don't know if tariffs are going to become a very big deterrent. We have to see in the short and long term. And then the other point I wanted to make is that the spark of this issue is the economy, which also was the mass protest in 2019. And sanctions are one of the main underlying reasons for this state of life for the Iranians. Yes, Iranians do see and complain that there's massive corruption inside the country, part of it tied to sanctions, that there's massive mismanagement of a country that's rich in natural resources, human capital. But sanctions are essentially the third part of this triangle. They all go hand in hand: mismanagement, corruption, sanctions, and they reinforce each other. And so the current state of life for average Iranians, for middle class, working class Iranians, and many of them, middle class is pushed into poverty, working classes are pushed even further. Part of it is this policy. And so is this going to help Iranian protesters in the short term? Definitely not. And in the long term, it's just going to add to the misery of average Iranians who mostly have very little say in the policies of the country, at least the foreign policy that the U.S., foreign and regional policy that the U.S. is so opposed to.
Which, of course, is why they took to the streets in the first place. So, Negar, keeping that in mind, I wonder, as we're talking about being on the brink, Iran wouldn't be the only place affected if things escalate to a military confrontation, because when tensions rise around Tehran, the shockwaves tend to hit across the region. We've seen that unfold before, whether it's attacks and counterattacks through allied groups, there's pressure on shipping routes, energy markets. Things sort of take a life of their own. So what are the regional consequences that perhaps people aren't fully grappling with yet?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought this up, because time and again, we have seen sort of this rhetoric in the U.S. that these kinds of regime change interventions, regime change wars are going to be quick and clean. Nobody told the American people that Afghanistan was going to take 20 years and that the keys would be handed back to the Taliban and the U.S. would have to pull out in that catastrophic measure. And I'm glad they did, because it was just getting worse. And the country would be in a situation that's even worse than when the U.S. attacked 20 years before that. No one said Iraq is going to take about 20 years, trillions of dollars, American blood and resources. And initially, these wars were seen as, clean, quick, we'll be in and out, regime change, democracy, nation building, women's rights, even in Afghanistan. That was one of the main talking points, women's rights. And look at where the country is right now, potentially, arguably worse than where it was 20 years ago. And so I'd like to know what the option is. If we're talking about military action, which seems to be the only tool the U.S. has in that region, I haven't seen many success stories of this kind of military action that would lead to a quick and fast and clean transition. We're not talking about an Eastern European color revolution or a peaceful transition of power. We're talking about a region that's very volatile. And so I really have a question. What is the option that we're talking about? When we say help is on the way, what does that look like? If our only tool is hard power, military power, how is that going to help the protesters? I mean, the images coming from Iran are horrific. The death toll is the highest, as far as I remember, in mass protests. But how exactly are we going to help? And this is what worries the neighbors. You know, the neighbors have seen this in the past. Turkey is worried. The Iraqis are worried. The countries across the Persian Gulf are all worried because any form of chaos will impact their situation, their safety, their security, their stability, their trade. I mean, Turkey has seen, for example, in Syria, where do the war refugees end up? In the neighboring countries.
Negar, I think it speaks to the quagmire that we appear to be in, that my question just raised further questions, and there don't appear to be answers to any of those. So I want to end here then where we started, with the people who are inside of Iran, who are calling for change, with the idea of the financial relief that they had perhaps 10 years ago evaporating when you fast forward to today. Will any of the scenarios that we talked about here facing Iranians right now, will any of them go towards addressing the reason that people took to the streets in the first place?
Potentially. I think there has to be hard choices made in Tehran, first of all, and then also potentially in the West, in Washington. But talking about the people, I'm glad you bring this back to people, Malika, because people on the street are not necessarily policymakers, and it's not their responsibility to provide the solution, not for their own leaders and not for the world. What they're saying, essentially putting their lives on the line, is that this status quo is not working for me. I have gotten poorer. Life has gotten more difficult. Inflation is through the roof. Prices don't match salaries. For those who have jobs, if there's unemployment, there's no prospect for the future. There's a class in the elite that's literally called sanctions profiteers, Kasabane Tahrim. They've gotten richer and more powerful from the situation and the corruption that the sanctions have provided. And that makes people angry. And this is not just people within the government. It's also state adjacent, or people who are involved in these back black market deals and the sanctions circumvention. So these policies have worked for some, but not for the majority. And I don't know anyone in Iran, and I speak to a lot of people of various walks of life in different towns and cities. I haven't heard anyone who said, yes, I'm happy this life is working for me. Almost everyone I speak to, and these are average people, I'm not talking about government officials. That's why they're going for the core of the system, and really the chants are very radical. So I don't know if that's being heard in Tehran, if this shifting of gears is going to happen. Also in Washington, is the U.S. going to help the situation, stay out, or just go in and make it worse and just wreak havoc to an already grim situation?
Negar, thank you for this sobering look at what lies ahead of us. I appreciate you walking us through.
Thank you so much for having me.